Jake's fingers hovered over the keyboard, his eyes bloodshot and tired. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead flickered faintly, almost as if they too were worn out from the grueling hours. He glanced at the clock, 2:47 a.m. Most of the office was empty now, the only sounds in the building coming from the whirring of computers and the occasional clink of metal on desks. The usual buzz of conversation was replaced by a heavy silence that felt almost suffocating. Just a little longer, Jake muttered to himself, adjusting his glasses and rubbing his eyes. He had been working non-stop for the last 12 hours, his mind already numb from the strain. He didn't even notice his phone buzz on the corner of his desk until it vibrated again, pulling him out of his daze. He picked it up with slow, deliberate movements, unlocking it to see a message from Mia, his wife. "Are you coming home soon? I miss you." He stared at the text, feeling a knot form in his stomach. Mia. He hadn't seen her in 2 days. The thought of her waiting at home, probably in bed alone, made his chest tighten. But then he glanced back at the computer screen, where lines of code and designs filled every inch of the screen, demanding his attention. Jake had always been the type to put everything into his work. He had joined SpaceX with dreams of reaching for the stars, literally. But now, months later, those stars felt like distant memories. His life had become a never-ending cycle of working late, missing out on family dinners, and occasionally hearing Mia's voice on the phone when he managed to sneak a break. It wasn't that he didn't love his job, it was just that the job seemed to demand more than he could give. With a sigh, Jake set his phone back down and tried to focus once more. But the message lingered in his mind, growing louder with each passing second. How long would he keep doing this? The thought was interrupted by the sound of footsteps coming from the hallway. He wasn't expecting anyone. He squinted at the clock again, wondering if maybe he had imagined the sound. The clock read 3:10 a.m. now. Everyone had left hours ago. Then the door swung open, and Jake froze, his heart skipping a beat. Standing in the doorway, dressed in his usual black hoodie and jeans, was none other than Elon Musk. Jake's stomach flipped. He blinked twice to make sure he wasn't seeing things. Was this a dream? No. It was really him, Elon Musk, the visionary, the leader of SpaceX, the one person who had inspired Jake to put everything on the line for his career. Jake had never met him before, but everyone at SpaceX had heard the stories. Elon didn't visit the office late at night unless there was something important going on. And right now, Jake could feel the weight of his presence in the room. "Jake, right?" Elon's voice was calm, almost casual, as if it were just another day. "Yes, sir." "Yes, it's me," Jake stammered, quickly standing up and brushing off crumbs from his desk. He couldn't help but feel like a child caught sneaking around in the middle of the night. "I was just walking around, checking in on things. I like to see how things are going on the ground level," Elon continued, walking further into the room and eyeing the screen on Jake's desk. "What's this you're working on?" Jake felt his nerves kick into overdrive. "Oh, this is a new design for the Falcon 9 booster. It's a rework of the current propulsion system. I was testing a few simulations," he trailed off, not sure if he was making any sense. How could he explain this to someone like Elon? This was the guy who had taken humanity to new heights, the one who had revolutionized space travel. And here Jake was, working past midnight, hoping to make something small enough to be noticed. Elon nodded, but Jake couldn't tell if it was out of genuine interest or simply a polite gesture. "Looks good. But, you've been here for a while, haven't you?" Jake hesitated. "Yeah, I've been pulling double shifts lately. There's a lot riding on this project." Elon raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp. "Double shifts? That's dedication. But is that sustainable? You can't be at your best if you're running on empty." Jake didn't know how to respond. Elon wasn't the type to sugarcoat things. Everyone at SpaceX was used to working long hours, but hearing it from the man himself made Jake feel exposed. It was almost like his tiredness had been laid bare, and now Elon was seeing him for what he really was, just another person trying to keep up in an endless race. "I'm just trying to make sure we're ahead of the game," Jake finally said, hoping his voice didn't betray the exhaustion he was feeling. "You know how it is." Elon nodded again, his eyes scanning the room, the space around him, as if taking it all in. "I do know. But that's the thing. We push hard, we innovate, and we make things happen. But we also have to know when to step back and recharge. You can't create the future if you burn out in the present, Jake." The words hit harder than Jake expected. He had always admired Elon's work ethic, his endless pursuit of the next big thing. But hearing Elon talk about balance, about taking care of yourself, struck him in a way he didn't expect. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt like someone saw him, not just as an employee, but as a person. "So, what do you recommend, sir?" Jake asked, almost out of habit. Elon smiled, the kind of smile that seemed to hold a wealth of knowledge behind it. "Take a break, Jake. You've been pushing yourself for a reason. But if you keep pushing at this pace, you won't be able to enjoy the rewards. Step back. You'll get there." The words were simple, yet profound. Jake didn't know what to say next, so he just nodded. And just like that, Elon Musk, the man who had reshaped the future of space exploration, had just given him a piece of advice that felt like a revelation. But before he could say anything, Elon gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Keep up the good work," Elon said before turning to leave. "We're counting on you." Jake stood there, his mind reeling. His heart was still pounding in his chest, the adrenaline of meeting Elon slowly wearing off. But as the sound of Elon's footsteps faded down the hallway, a strange sense of clarity washed over him. For the first time in months, Jake wasn't just thinking about the next deadline or the next breakthrough. He was thinking about the bigger picture, about finding a way to balance his passion for work with the people who mattered most. Maybe this was the wake-up call he needed. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jake sat back down at his desk, staring blankly at the simulation window on his screen. Elon's words echoed in his mind. "You can't create the future if you burn out in the present." He rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of it all. For years, he had been running on fumes, pouring every ounce of energy into his work. But was it worth it? Had he sacrificed everything just for the chance to do something great? He glanced at the family photo frame sitting next to his keyboard. It was a picture of Mia and him from their vacation 2 years ago, a snapshot of a simpler time, back when their lives weren't consumed by deadlines and work demands. Back when things weren't so complicated. Jake had always been a dreamer, even as a child. Growing up in a small town in Texas, he was fascinated by space. His bedroom walls were covered with posters of rockets, planets, and astronauts. He would spend hours watching documentaries about space missions and reading up on the latest advancements in technology. It was no surprise when he chose to pursue a degree in aerospace engineering at Stanford University. SpaceX was his dream job. The opportunity to contribute to something as monumental as colonizing Mars, what could be more exciting than that? But the reality of working at a company like SpaceX was far different from what he had imagined. After graduation, Jake was ecstatic when he received the call from SpaceX. He'd worked hard, struggled through sleepless nights, and sacrificed everything for this moment. When he landed the position, it felt like all of his dreams were coming true. He moved to California, leaving behind the quiet life he'd known for the chaos of Silicon Valley. In the beginning, things had been exciting. The work was groundbreaking, and the team he worked with was full of brilliant minds. Jake felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, contributing to humanity's future. But as the months went by, the pressure mounted. Deadlines became tighter, expectations grew higher, and the relentless pace of innovation left no room for rest. There was a time when Jake believed the long hours were part of the deal. If you want to change the world, you have to give everything, he had told himself. But soon, the exhaustion started to set in. The late nights at the office became a routine, and Jake found himself losing touch with everything he had once held dear, his hobbies, his friends, and most painfully, his wife, Mia. Mia had been understanding at first. When Jake started his job, she knew what she was getting into. She had always been supportive of his dreams, even if it meant sacrifices. But as the months wore on, the sacrifices grew heavier. Jake stopped showing up to family dinners, missed their anniversary, and often forgot about important events. Mia was patient at first, but even her patience had its limits. One evening, Jake had come home late after a particularly grueling day at the office. Mia was sitting at the kitchen table, her face drawn and tired. She looked up when he entered, offering a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Jake, we need to talk," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Jake set his bag down, suddenly feeling the weight of the conversation. "What's wrong?" Mia took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them on the table. "I don't know how much longer I can do this. You're never home. You never have time for us. And when you do come home, you're too exhausted to talk. I miss you, Jake. I miss the person you used to be." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had known things weren't perfect, but hearing her say it out loud made him realize just how much he had been neglecting their relationship. Jake tried to explain himself, to tell her that this was just a phase, that once the project was finished, everything would go back to normal. But Mia wasn't convinced. "Maybe you'll finish this project, and maybe you'll get the recognition you deserve. But what happens when the next one comes around? And the next one after that? When will it ever be enough?" Jake had no answer. The conversation that night ended with Mia in tears, and Jake in silence. The guilt gnawed at him, but there was nothing he could do. The work had become all-consuming. He had let it take over every aspect of his life. Back at SpaceX, things weren't much better. Jake had moved up the ranks quickly, landing a position in the propulsion department. His colleagues respected his work ethic, but the constant pressure from upper management was wearing him down. He was tasked with one critical project after another, each one more demanding than the last. The deadlines felt like a ticking clock, and Jake was running out of time to get everything right. Every mistake felt like a step closer to failure. His interactions with David, his new team lead, didn't help. David was a stickler for perfection, and while Jake admired his drive, it often felt like nothing was ever good enough. There was always room for improvement, always something to tweak, always another revision to make. The constant feedback, the never-ending adjustments, it wore on Jake. "Jake, this needs to be perfect. If we don't hit this deadline, the whole project is at risk," David had said earlier that day, his voice sharp and uncompromising. Jake had nodded, though his insides twisted in frustration. He was doing everything he could, but it was never enough. He was drowning in expectations, unable to find a way to stay afloat. The weight of the project felt heavier with each passing hour. And now, as Jake sat in the dimly lit office, staring at the lines of code and design blueprints on his screen, he realized how far he had drifted from the person he used to be. Where was the excitement, the joy of creating something new? Where was the passion he had felt when he first started? The worst part was that Mia was slipping further away, and he was too lost in his work to do anything about it. His personal life was unraveling, but he was too consumed with the idea of proving himself to fix it. He had become so focused on his career that he couldn't even see the damage it was doing to the people who mattered most. As Jake sat there, his mind wandered back to that moment with Elon. He had expected Elon to come in and offer praise, to talk about the groundbreaking projects they were working on. But instead, Elon had given him something more valuable, perspective. Jake leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. The path ahead of him wasn't clear, but for the first time in a long time, he was beginning to realize that maybe it was time to reevaluate everything: the work, the sacrifices, and, most importantly, his relationships. He wasn't sure what the next step was, but he knew one thing for certain: things couldn't stay the way they were. The next morning, Jake walked into the office with a heavy heart, but his mind was clearer than it had been in weeks. Elon's words still resonated in his mind. You can't create the future if you burn out in the present. He couldn't ignore the truth in that anymore. His marriage, his health, even his passion for work, everything had been deteriorating. But that didn't mean things could just snap back into place. His current state was the product of months, maybe even years, of neglecting the things that truly mattered. Still, Jake knew there was no easy fix. His job at SpaceX was demanding, and the pressure to perform was constant. As soon as he walked through the doors that morning, he could feel the weight of the work ahead. There was no time to waste. Jake. Good morning. David's voice broke through Jake's thoughts, pulling him back to reality. David was standing at the edge of his desk, looking as sharp as ever in his pressed shirt and neatly combed hair. Jake tried to smile back, but the smile felt forced. David's expectations weighed heavily on him. In the beginning, Jake had admired his relentless work ethic, but now, it just felt suffocating. Morning, Jake said, keeping his tone neutral as he slid into his chair. David didn't waste any time. I need those revisions by noon today. If we don't hit this milestone, the whole project could be delayed by weeks. We don't have that kind of time. He tossed a stack of papers onto Jake's desk with a sharp gesture. Make it happen. Jake's stomach clenched as he glanced at the papers. It was more than just a few revisions. The weight of the task seemed to double in an instant. He had barely gotten any sleep over the past few nights, and now, with this new set of demands, it felt like everything was stacking up against him. I'll get to it, Jake said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. David nodded, but there was something in his eyes, a subtle look that Jake couldn't quite read. I don't need to tell you how important this is, Jake. We're counting on you. Don't let me down. The pressure in Jake's chest intensified as David walked away. He glanced at the clock. It was already 9:30 a.m., and he had barely started on his current tasks. He opened the file David had handed him, feeling the dread settle deeper into his bones as he began reviewing the changes. It was overwhelming. The revisions were complex, and Jake knew the slightest mistake could throw everything off. Every task at SpaceX felt like it carried the weight of the world, but today, it felt especially crushing. The thought of failure gnawed at him relentlessly. As Jake worked through the morning, his thoughts kept drifting back to his conversation with Mia. She had been distant the past few weeks, and though she hadn't said much, he could tell something was wrong. She was no longer calling him during the day like she used to. Their conversations had become short and lacking in the warmth they once shared. The worst part? Jake wasn't sure how to fix it. After all, what was he supposed to say to her? Sorry, Mia, I'll be home after I finish this project, next week. He knew she would say something about his priorities, but he wasn't ready to hear it yet. He wasn't ready to admit how much he had neglected her, how much he had neglected everything else in his life. His phone buzzed on his desk, and for a moment, Jake hoped it was Mia reaching out. But when he picked it up, it was a message from his best friend, Sam. Sam had always been the one to keep him grounded, the voice of reason when Jake got too caught up in his work. Hey man, how's the project going? You alive over there? Jake stared at the message for a second. He could feel his shoulders tightening, the weight of his responsibilities pulling him deeper into a pit of anxiety. He didn't have time to chat. He was drowning in work, and he was barely keeping his head above water. Busy. Trying to make sense of all the changes David threw my way. Might need a couple more hours at the office. His phone buzzed again, a quick reply from Sam, don't burn yourself out, dude. You know I'm here if you need to talk. Jake snorted under his breath. Sam always had a way of simplifying things. Talking wouldn't change the fact that he was stuck in a cycle he couldn't break, a cycle of never-ending work and mounting pressure. There wasn't time to talk, there was only time to work. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Jake barely noticed when the office lights dimmed in the late afternoon. The hum of the computers around him became a dull, monotonous sound. His fingers moved mechanically, typing out the code, adjusting the simulations, making revisions. There was no room for error. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not now. But just as Jake was about to dive into the final round of changes, his phone buzzed again. He checked it absently, expecting another message from Sam. But this time, it was from Mia. "Jake, we need to talk. I can't keep doing this. You're never here, and I'm losing you." Jake's heart dropped. He stared at the message for a long time, the words swimming in his vision. His chest tightened, and a wave of guilt crashed over him. "We need to talk." The phrase echoed in his mind, and he knew what was coming. Mia was done waiting. She was giving him an ultimatum, and he wasn't sure he was ready for it. He had been so focused on work, so obsessed with the idea of proving himself, that he hadn't noticed how much he had been neglecting her. Jake felt like he was caught between two worlds. On one side, there was the career that defined him, SpaceX, innovation, and the promise of something greater. But on the other side, there was the woman he loved, the life he had built outside of work. And right now, it felt like he was losing both. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to find David standing there, his expression unreadable. "Got those revisions?" David asked, his tone impersonal. Jake nodded, though his mind was far from the project at hand. He handed David the files, but his heart wasn't in it. He had never felt more torn in his life. David's eyes briefly flickered to Jake's phone, still lit up with Mia's message, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he took the files and nodded curtly. "Good. We need to keep this project on track. I'll be checking in on you later." Jake watched him leave, his mind a whirlwind of confusion. The conflict was clear, work was demanding everything, but Mia was asking for what little he had left. And if he didn't find a way to fix things, he risked losing both. The weight of it all pressed on Jake's chest. He was stuck. Jake had never felt more torn in his life. The days blurred together, each one feeling like an extension of the last. The work piled up, more revisions, more demands, more pressure. Every time Jake thought he might catch a breath, something new came his way. David's expectations grew higher, and with each task, Jake felt like he was falling further behind. But the real battle was happening inside him. Mia's words from the day before echoed relentlessly in his mind, "I can't keep doing this. You're never here, and I'm losing you." He had promised her that things would get better. That after this project, after the crunch, they would have time for themselves. But that felt like an empty promise. Mia needed him now, and he wasn't there. It hurt him more than he cared to admit, but what could he do? Yet every time he sat down at his desk, the glowing screen in front of him felt more like a prison than a path to success. His fingers moved mechanically across the keyboard, but his mind kept drifting back to Mia. He thought about how she used to laugh when they watched movies on the couch late at night. He thought about their long walks in the park, where they'd talk about everything but work. But now, Mia's presence felt like a distant memory. He could feel her slipping away with each passing day. Her messages were becoming shorter, colder. She was tired of waiting. And maybe she had every right to be. Jake sat at his desk, staring at the simulation screen in front of him. The equations and designs blurred together as he thought about the call he had received earlier that morning. It was from Sam. He had been his rock for years, the one person Jake could always count on to remind him of what really mattered. "Hey man, we need to talk." Sam's words had hit Jake like a ton of bricks. Sam didn't often call him during the day, so the tone of his voice was enough to raise alarms. Jake had ignored it, choosing to dive back into the work that was never ending, but as the hours passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe he was in too deep. The phone buzzed again, and for a moment, Jake thought it was Sam. But no, it was Mia. Another message. This one was different. "Jake, I'm serious. If you don't make time for us soon, I think I need space. I don't know how much longer I can do this." Jake closed his eyes. His chest tightened. It was the last thing he wanted to hear, but it felt like the inevitable conclusion. The cracks in their relationship were wide enough now that even he couldn't pretend everything was fine. His heart sank as he read her message over and over. He had always believed he could fix things. But fixing things required more than just good intentions. It required action. He set his phone down and leaned back in his chair. He could hear the hum of the office around him, the sound of computers, the voices of his colleagues, but it felt distant, muffled. He was losing grip on everything that mattered. That's when his mind went back to Elon. Jake had always respected Elon's vision, his drive, his relentless pursuit of the impossible. Elon had always been the type of person who saw the bigger picture, and that was something Jake admired. But he couldn't deny that there was a toll to that vision, something no one talked about. It was easy to be caught up in the work, to be swept away by the excitement of the mission, but what if that came at the cost of everything else? What if, in trying to build something extraordinary, he was destroying the one thing he had always wanted, his family? Jake had to make a decision. A part of him knew it was time to take a step back, to find a way to balance his work with the people who mattered most. But the other part of him, the part that had always believed in giving everything for the greater good, didn't know how to let go. "Jake," David's voice interrupted his thoughts. Jake looked up, startled, as David stood at the door of his office, a determined look in his eyes. "We need to talk about the next phase of the project. We're behind schedule." Jake nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. "I know. I'll get to it right away." David stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the pile of papers and the simulation results on Jake's desk. "Jake, you've been working non-stop. I appreciate your dedication, but I need you to be at your best for this next phase. You've been off your game lately. If you're going to make this work, you need to focus." Jake swallowed. "I'm focused. I've got a lot going on right now." David gave him a measured look. "We all do. But this project can't wait. We need results. If we don't hit these targets, it'll affect everything." Jake nodded, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his chest. He had always prided himself on being able to push through the toughest situations, but lately, it was becoming harder to ignore the personal toll. How much longer could he keep this up? "I'll get it done," Jake said, his voice lacking its usual conviction. David gave him a brief nod and left without another word. Jake stared at his screen, the pressure building once more. The truth was, he was stretched thin, physically, emotionally, mentally. He had never felt so isolated in his life. The constant tension between his career and his personal life was unbearable, and each day, it seemed to get worse. His phone buzzed again, another message from Mia. "Jake, I'm not sure what's going to happen, but I can't keep living like this. I need you to make a choice." Jake's breath caught in his throat. The ultimatum was clear. He had to choose, his career or his family. It was a decision he had been avoiding, but now, it was unavoidable. And that's when he knew. He couldn't keep going like this. He had to make a change. But how? How could he possibly balance these two worlds when each one was demanding everything from him? As Jake sat there, the room around him faded. He had always dreamed of working at SpaceX, of contributing to humanity's future. But in that moment, he realized something important: no success, no accomplishment, no mission was worth losing the ones he loved. Jake's heart was heavy, but he knew what he had to do. The question was, would he have the strength to follow through? Jake's eyes hovered over the glowing screen in front of him, but his mind was far away. The office around him felt like it was closing in, the hum of computers and murmurs of co-workers fading into white noise. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, yet nothing seemed important anymore. The equations, the simulations, the project, all of it had started to feel distant, as if none of it mattered compared to the battle raging inside him. Mia's message from earlier that day was still there, haunting him. "I need you to make a choice." The words were simple, but they weighed on him like a 1,000-pound anchor pulling him under. It was the question that had been gnawing at him for weeks, and now it was here, laid out plainly, demanding an answer. Jake had spent so much of his life focused on building his career, carving out a place for himself in a world where success was measured by how much you could accomplish. But in doing so, he had forgotten what truly mattered: his family, his relationships, the people who had always been there for him. The truth hit him like a slap to the face. He had been living in a bubble, chasing after the illusion of success, ignoring the cracks in the walls of his personal life. He had always thought that if he could just push a little harder, if he could just give a little more, he could make everything work. But now, it was clear. He had been wrong. Jake's hand trembled as he reached for his phone. His heart pounded in his chest. Mia had been patient with him for so long, and yet, here they were, standing at the edge of something irreparable. He had been too focused on SpaceX, on his ambitions, to see that he was slowly losing the person he loved the most. He opened his messages, his thumb hovering over the screen as he debated what to say. But before he could type a word, his phone rang. It was Mia. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He stared at the screen for a moment, frozen. What was he supposed to say? How could he fix this? Taking a deep breath, he swiped to answer. "Mia," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "Jake," Mia's voice was quiet, fragile. "We need to talk." Jake closed his eyes, the weight of her words sinking in. He knew what was coming. This was it, the moment everything changed. He had been avoiding this conversation for too long, but there was no running from it now. "I know," he whispered, his throat tightening. "I've been thinking a lot, Mia. About everything. About us." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. He could hear the faint sound of her breathing, and it made his heart ache. "I don't want to do this, Jake," Mia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't keep waiting for you to realize what matters. I love you, but I can't keep living like this." Jake's chest tightened, and the lump in his throat grew. "Mia, please. I didn't realize how much I was neglecting you. I'm sorry. I know I've been distant. I know I've put everything else ahead of us, and I hate myself for it." Mia sighed softly, a sound filled with exhaustion. "Jake, I don't want you to hate yourself. I just want you to see that I need you. We need you. You're here, but you're not really here. And I can't keep pretending that everything's okay when it's not." Jake swallowed hard, trying to find the right words, but nothing felt right. The truth was, he didn't know how to fix things. He had spent so much time building his career, his future, that he hadn't even realized he was losing his present. "Mia, I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to make it right," Jake admitted, the frustration clear in his voice. Mia's tone softened, but there was an unmistakable edge of sadness there. "I don't know either, Jake. I don't know if we can fix this. Maybe we've just grown too far apart. But I need you to understand that I can't wait around forever." Jake's heart shattered at her words. He had always thought that their love would be enough, that they could weather any storm. But now, he wasn't so sure. "I can't lose you, Mia," Jake whispered, the desperation in his voice palpable. "I'll do whatever it takes. I will change. I'll find a way to balance this. I promise." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Mia's voice was barely audible when she spoke again. I don't want promises, Jake. I need actions. Show me that you're willing to fight for this, for us. Jake felt a surge of emotion overwhelm him. He knew this was his breaking point, the point where he had to choose. He couldn't keep pretending that his work was more important than the woman he loved. The space he had carved for himself at SpaceX had consumed him, and now he had to make a choice. Would he continue down this path, chasing after an impossible dream, or would he put his energy into what truly mattered? I will fight for us, Jake said, his voice firm for the first time in days. I don't know how yet, but I will. I will prove it to you, Mia. I'm not going to lose you. I can't. Mia's voice cracked with emotion. I need to see that, Jake. Words are empty without action. I can't keep waiting for you to figure it out. You have to make a choice, and soon. Jake's eyes blurred with tears, but he didn't care. This was the moment that would define him, the moment where he stopped running and started making things right. I'm coming home, he said with finality. I'm coming home to fix this, Mia. We'll figure it out together. Mia was quiet for a moment, and then she whispered, I hope so, Jake. I really hope so. As the call ended, Jake sat there, the weight of her words still hanging heavily in the air. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was at the edge of something. A decision had been made, and it was terrifying. But it was also liberating. He stood up from his desk, the noise of the office fading into the background. The space he had been pouring his heart into for so long suddenly felt hollow. He wasn't just fighting for a project anymore. He was fighting for his family, for his future, for his own happiness. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door. The world outside was waiting, and it was time for him to step into it, fully present, fully aware of what really mattered. Jake's car hummed steadily along the road, but his mind was far from focused on the drive. The events of the last few hours had set everything in motion, and he was finally heading home. He couldn't help but think of the words Mia had spoken during their phone call earlier, I need you to make a choice. It felt like the weight of the world was resting on his shoulders, pressing down on him with every passing mile. The weight of that decision, his choice, had been on his mind for weeks. He couldn't shake the image of Mia's face when she had said that she couldn't keep waiting. The pain in her voice was like a knife twisting in his chest, and he had felt it deeply. But now, as he drove, he knew that this moment was one he couldn't take lightly. He was at a crossroads, and no matter how much he wanted to pretend he could balance both his career and his relationship, reality had a way of catching up with you. The truth was clear, something had to give. Jake's thoughts drifted back to his time at SpaceX, his career that had once been the center of his world. The relentless pursuit of success had consumed him. And though he had always told himself that he was doing this for his future, for something bigger than himself, it wasn't that simple. His ambition had blinded him to the toll it was taking on the people who mattered most. As he approached the familiar turn to their street, Jake had a realization: his work, his success, could never replace the love and support that Mia had always given him. No amount of accomplishments or breakthroughs in space exploration could replace her. He parked his car in the driveway, the engine shutting off with a soft click. His heart pounded, the anticipation of the conversation he was about to have filling him with a mixture of dread and hope. He wasn't sure if he could fix everything, but he knew he had to try. For Mia. For them. Jake stepped out of the car, his legs shaky as he walked toward the front door. Each step felt heavier than the last, but there was also a sense of determination growing inside him. He had let this go on for too long, but now he was ready to make things right. It was time to prove to Mia, to himself, that he could do better. When he opened the door, the quiet of their home wrapped around him, a stark contrast to the chaos he had left behind at the office. Mia was in the living room, sitting on the couch, her eyes tired but still full of warmth. She looked up as he entered, her gaze soft but guarded. Jake, she said quietly, her voice tinged with the same exhaustion that had been there in her messages. You're here. I'm here, Jake replied, his voice full of conviction. He took a step toward her, but then stopped. This was it, the moment where he had to show her that his words weren't just empty promises. Mia looked at him for a long moment before speaking again. So, what now? What are you going to do, Jake? Are you going to keep working yourself to the bone, telling me you're doing it for us, when it's clear you're doing it for something else? Jake swallowed hard. I've been selfish, Mia. I've been so caught up in my career and this drive to succeed that I forgot about the people who really matter. I lost sight of us. And that was the biggest mistake I've ever made. Mia's eyes softened slightly, but she didn't look away. Jake, I don't want to hear excuses. I want to see action. I need you to show me that you're willing to fight for us, not just say it. He nodded, taking a step closer to her. I will. I promise. I can't change everything overnight, but I will start. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. I'll be here for you, Mia. I'm ready to make the sacrifices. I'm ready to be the man you deserve. Mia took a deep breath, her expression still a mix of uncertainty and hope. I want to believe you, Jake. I really do. But it's going to take time. It's going to take effort. I can't just forget all the times you've chosen work over us. I need you to prove it. Jake nodded again, his heart heavy with understanding. I know. I'll prove it, Mia. I'll show you every single day that I'm here. That I'm all in. They stood there in silence for a long moment, the weight of the conversation hanging between them. Jake knew that this wasn't the end of the road. It was only the beginning. Rebuilding trust, rebuilding their relationship, it would take time. But he was ready for the challenge. He had already lost so much. He wasn't going to let go of the most important thing he had left. Mia's voice broke the silence. Jake, I don't need grand gestures. I just need you to be present. I need you to show up. That's all I've ever asked for. He walked over to her and took her hand in his grip firm and reassuring. I'm here, Mia. I'm all in. I'm not going anywhere. A small tear escaped from Mia's eye, but she smiled, a soft, vulnerable smile that made Jake's heart swell with relief. It wasn't a smile of complete forgiveness, but it was a start. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jake felt like he was finally on the right path. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least now he wasn't walking it alone. He had Mia by his side, and he had a second chance. As they sat down together on the couch, Jake knew that this was the most important decision he had ever made. He wasn't going to let his dreams of success tear apart everything he had worked for outside of work. He was ready to fight for the love that had been there all along. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The next few weeks passed by in a blur for Jake. He had promised Mia that he would change, that he would be more present, more committed to their relationship. But the reality of keeping that promise was proving more difficult than he had anticipated. The demands of his job at SpaceX were relentless. There were late nights, long meetings, and projects that seemed to never end. But Jake was determined. Every day, he fought to find a balance between his work and his life at home. He had stopped bringing work home, something that had been a near impossibility for him before. His phone, which had once been a constant companion for late-night emails and calls, now sat silent on the kitchen counter as he spent his evenings with Mia. The first few days had been awkward, small talk and hesitant conversations filled the gaps where the unspoken tension had once lived. But slowly, they began to find their rhythm again. One evening, Jake was sitting at the dining table, sipping on a cup of coffee, when Mia walked in, holding a stack of papers. She had a soft smile on her face as she dropped the papers onto the table in front of him. "These are the things I wanted to talk about," she said, sitting across from him. They're just small details, but I think they matter. Jake leaned in, looking at the papers. They were simple things, plans for the weekend, ideas for a vacation, lists of things they had to do around the house, but to Jake, they were a symbol of something bigger. It was Mia's way of saying she was ready to share more of her world with him again, to include him in the little things that mattered. It was a sign of trust. "Okay," Jake said softly. "Let's go through them." As they began to talk, Jake could feel the walls that had once existed between them starting to crumble. The more they shared, the more he realized how much he had missed out on. The little things, the details, the moments that once felt so insignificant, were now the most precious part of their relationship. "I want us to plan something fun this weekend," Mia said, looking at him expectantly. "A trip, a day out, something we can enjoy together." Jake smiled. It was a simple request, but it meant the world to him. "I'm in. Let's do it." Mia's smile was warm, but there was still a guardedness in her eyes, something Jake knew they would have to work through. He didn't blame her. Trust wasn't something you could rebuild overnight. But every small gesture, every conversation, every moment they spent together was one more step toward healing. Over the next few days, Jake found himself facing an internal struggle. His dedication to his job was still strong, and he couldn't deny the sense of pride he felt when he made progress on his projects at SpaceX. But the more he experienced the quiet moments at home with Mia, the more he understood the importance of finding a balance. He couldn't let his ambition overshadow the things that mattered most. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Jake found himself standing at the kitchen sink, washing dishes. He had gotten into the habit of helping out more around the house, something Mia had always appreciated. As he scrubbed the plates, his mind wandered to the conversation they had had just a few days earlier. He couldn't keep making excuses. He couldn't keep justifying his workaholic tendencies by telling himself he was doing it for their future. He had already lost too much. Mia's voice, soft and filled with uncertainty, echoed in his mind, "I need you to show up." Jake put down the dish he had been holding and wiped his hands on a towel. He walked into the living room, where Mia was sitting on the couch, reading a book. The light from the lamp above her cast a warm glow over her face, and for the first time in a long time, Jake saw her for what she was, his partner, his equal, the person he had taken for granted. "Mia," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I know I've messed up. I know I can't change everything overnight, but I want you to know that I'm trying. I'm really trying." Mia looked up from her book, her expression soft but thoughtful. She put the book down and sat up straighter, studying him for a moment. "I know you're trying, Jake," she said quietly. "And I see that. But it's not just about the big gestures. It's about the little things. Being there, even when it's hard. You don't have to be perfect, but you have to show up." Jake nodded, a weight lifting from his chest as he finally understood what Mia had been saying all along. It wasn't about being flawless. It was about showing up when it counted. It was about being present, both physically and emotionally. "I will," he promised. "I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere." Mia smiled, a small but genuine smile, and reached for his hand. "I believe you." In the days that followed, Jake kept his promise. He showed up, both in the big moments and the small ones. He took time off work to spend a weekend with Mia, going on the trip they had planned together. It wasn't anything extravagant, a simple weekend getaway to a nearby town, but it was perfect. They laughed, they talked, and they reconnected in ways that Jake hadn't realized they were missing. As they walked through the streets of the small town, hand in hand, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. He realized that success wasn't defined by his career alone. Success was measured by the relationships he built, the love he shared, and the moments he spent with the people who mattered most. Mia glanced up at him, her eyes filled with warmth. "I'm glad you're here," she said softly. Jake squeezed her hand. I'm glad I'm here too. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jake knew that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. It wasn't always going to be easy, but as long as he kept showing up, he had hoped that they could rebuild their love, brick by brick, moment by moment. Jake woke up early the next morning, the soft light of dawn creeping through the blinds. He reached for his phone instinctively, but then remembered the new rule he had set for himself: no work before breakfast. He had spent so much of the past year consumed by emails and meetings that he'd barely had time to notice the changing seasons or the subtle moments that made life worth living. It was time to change that. Today was going to be different. He stretched, feeling the stiffness in his muscles from the long week at work, and then padded quietly to the kitchen. Mia was already there, standing by the coffee machine, her back to him as she hummed softly to herself. Jake smiled at the peaceful scene. For once, there were no rush, no deadlines hanging over their heads. Just a moment of calm. "Morning," Jake said, his voice still thick with sleep. Mia turned around with a smile, handing him a steaming cup of coffee. "Morning. You're up early." "I'm trying something new," Jake said, sitting down at the kitchen table. "I'm not checking my phone first thing. Just, being present, you know." Mia raised an eyebrow. "I like that idea." As they ate breakfast together, they talked about simple things: plans for the weekend, a new movie Mia wanted to watch, how they could redecorate the living room. There was no pressure, no sense of urgency. For once, it felt like they were just two people enjoying each other's company, not two people fighting for space in a life that was always moving too fast. But as the day went on, Jake began to feel the weight of the reality that still hung over him. Despite his best efforts, work was always calling. Emails, conference calls, and a new project that was quickly becoming a top priority. It was like a tug-of-war inside his mind, his desire to be the partner Mia needed and his need to excel in his career, to prove himself worthy of the opportunities he'd worked so hard to achieve. By mid-afternoon, Jake had already spent an hour going over work emails in between sips of coffee. The pressure was mounting again, as he knew there were tasks he couldn't ignore. His phone pinged with a new notification, and he glanced at the screen. Another urgent request from one of the higher-ups at SpaceX. This time, it wasn't something he could just pass off to someone else. He sighed and rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar tension creep in. Mia had been in the other room, but she appeared in the doorway just as he put down his phone. Her face was unreadable, but there was a softness in her gaze that told Jake she knew exactly what was happening. "You're doing it again, aren't you?" she asked quietly. Jake looked up at her, guilty. "I have to. This stuff isn't going to fix itself." Mia crossed the room, sitting down across from him at the table. She didn't say anything right away, just looked at him with that quiet patience she always had. It was a gift and a curse, because Jake knew what she was thinking. She wasn't asking for grand gestures anymore. She was asking for him to be there. To be present. To make the choice to put down the phone and focus on what really mattered. "I get it," she finally said, her voice soft but firm. "I know your work is important to you. I'm not saying you have to quit or even scale back. But we need to find a balance, Jake. I can't keep being an afterthought to your career." Jake took a deep breath. He had heard this before, but this time it felt different. There was no anger in her words, just a quiet sadness, an exhaustion that reflected his own feelings. She was tired of competing for his attention. He could see it in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Mia," Jake said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I know I've been selfish. I didn't mean for you to feel like that." Mia nodded, her lips pressed into a tight line. "I don't want to feel like I'm second to everything else. You promised me you would change. I just need you to show up, not just when it's convenient." Jake stared down at the table, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his coffee cup. He didn't know how to make her understand that he was doing this for them, to secure a future where they could have everything they wanted. But at that moment, he realized that his definition of success had been flawed. He had put his work above everything else, believing that it would fix all their problems. But now, he saw that the real issue wasn't about how much money he could make or how many hours he could work. It was about being there for Mia, about showing up when she needed him. "I'm going to do better," he promised, looking up at her. "I'm not perfect, and I'll make mistakes, but I'll do better. I'll make more time for us. I won't let this job take everything." Mia sighed, her eyes softening. "I want to believe you, Jake. I really do. But it's not just about the time you spend with me. It's about being here, mentally. I don't want to feel like I'm talking to a ghost while you're working on autopilot." Jake nodded. He understood now. It wasn't just the hours spent together, it was the quality of the time. It was about being engaged, being present in their conversations, in their moments of peace. It was about reconnecting, not just with Mia, but with himself as well. "I'll be here," Jake said, his voice firm. "I'm not going to let work take over anymore. We'll find the balance. We'll make it work." Mia smiled, a small, hopeful smile that tugged at Jake's heart. It wasn't a smile of complete forgiveness, but it was a step forward. It was a sign that she was willing to give him the chance to prove himself. The next few days were a delicate balance of work and personal life. Jake continued to prioritize his time with Mia, but the pull of his responsibilities at SpaceX never fully went away. He was making progress, but it felt like a constant struggle. One evening, after a particularly stressful day, Jake sat down with Mia on the couch, his phone turned off for once. He rested his head on the back of the couch and let out a long sigh. "This is harder than I thought," he admitted. "But I'm trying. I don't want to lose what we have." Mia placed her hand on his, her fingers warm against his skin. "I know. And I don't want to lose us either. We're a team, Jake. But we have to be in it together." Jake smiled softly. "We will be. I'll make sure of it." And for the first time in a long time, he believed it. The weeks after Jake and Mia's heart-to-heart were filled with a mix of hope and hard truths. Jake was trying. He really was. He had started setting boundaries with his work, cutting back on his late-night emails and long hours at the office. Weekends were for Mia, for their time together. But no matter how much he tried to be present, the reality of his high-stakes job was always lurking, waiting to throw him off balance. One Thursday afternoon, Jake was at the SpaceX headquarters, overseeing the final stages of a major project. His team had been working tirelessly for months, and the end was finally in sight. But with every milestone they crossed, more challenges seemed to arise. A critical component had malfunctioned, and the engineers were scrambling to find a solution. Jake's phone buzzed constantly, each message bringing news of delays and complications. It was enough to make him feel like he was drowning. He stepped outside for a moment of fresh air, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket. The cool breeze helped clear his mind, but the weight of responsibility was still heavy on his shoulders. The project wasn't just about SpaceX's future, it was about his future, his reputation, and his ability to prove himself in an industry that demanded perfection. Jake took a deep breath, trying to shake off the growing sense of panic that threatened to overwhelm him. He knew Mia was counting on him, but in this moment, he had no choice. The work had to come first. As he headed back inside, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from Mia. "Mia, hey, I was thinking about taking a quick trip this weekend. Just the two of us. What do you think?" Jake smiled at the message, but as quickly as the warmth spread, guilt followed. This weekend had been earmarked for their time together, a chance to reconnect and rebuild. But here he was, facing an impossible decision. Should he tell her about the setbacks at work? Or should he just keep pushing forward, like he had done before? He replied quickly, trying to keep his tone light. "Jake, sounds great. I'll check my schedule when I can." I'll let you know. A few moments later, his phone rang. It was the project manager from the team, and Jake knew it wasn't going to be good news. "Jake," the manager said, his voice tense. "We've hit a major issue. The system we were testing, it's failed. We need you here immediately. We're looking at significant delays." Jake's heart sank. This was the kind of crisis he'd hoped to avoid, but here it was, demanding his full attention. He stared at the phone for a moment, feeling torn between his duty at work and his promise to Mia. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, Jake said, trying to hide the frustration in his voice. He hung up and ran his hand through his hair. For a moment, he stood there, feeling the weight of the choices that lay ahead. Later that evening, Jake found himself standing at the door to their apartment, his key in hand. The events of the day had consumed him, and by the time he got home, it was late, later than he had planned. He had promised Mia that he would be home in time for dinner, but instead, he was now looking at the locked door in front of him. He opened it slowly, stepping inside. The lights were dim, and the apartment felt unnervingly quiet. He heard Mia moving around in the kitchen, and for a brief moment, Jake hoped she hadn't noticed how late it was. "Mia," he called out, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. She appeared from the kitchen, holding a glass of wine in her hand. There was no anger in her expression, but there was something more unsettling, a quiet disappointment that felt even heavier than an outburst. "You're late," Mia said, her voice even but tinged with sadness. "I know," Jake replied, walking towards her. "I'm sorry. We ran into some issues at work. I tried to get out earlier, but..." Mia didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him, and in the silence, Jake could feel the gulf between them widening. It wasn't the first time he had made a choice like this, and Mia was starting to feel the consequences. "I was really looking forward to this weekend," Mia said, her voice soft but firm. "You promised we'd have this time. You promised." Jake stepped closer, reaching for her hand, but Mia pulled it away. The gesture stung more than he wanted to admit. He'd crossed a line again. And this time, there was no hiding it. "I know, Mia," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I'm sorry. I should have done better. I'll make it up to you, I swear." Mia took a deep breath, her eyes looking far too tired. "It's not about making it up, Jake. It's about consistency. It's about making me a priority, even when the work gets tough. We can't keep doing this." "I'm trying, Mia," Jake said, his voice cracking a little. "I swear I am. But you know how important this is. If I don't fix this now, it could mean the end of everything I've worked for. And if I lose that..." Mia looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "And if you lose me?" Jake froze. The question hit him harder than he expected. He had always been driven, obsessed even, with his work. But in that moment, he realized that if he didn't start prioritizing what truly mattered, the thing that he feared losing most would slip away quietly, in the moments he took for granted. "I don't want to lose you," Jake whispered. "I can't lose you." Mia sighed and set her glass down on the counter. "Then you need to prove it, Jake. Not with words, but with actions. I need to see you putting in the effort, every day, not just when it's convenient. I'm not going to wait around forever." Jake swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had no more excuses left. "I'll do better," he promised. "I'll find a way. I won't make the same mistake again." For a moment, Mia just stared at him, as if weighing his sincerity. Then, she nodded slowly. "We'll see." The rest of the evening was quiet, and Jake went to bed with a sinking feeling in his chest. Mia's words echoed in his mind, but he couldn't shake the fact that something deeper had shifted between them. He had promised to be present, but the relentless pull of work was harder to ignore than ever. In the coming days, Jake would have to decide what mattered most, the future he was building with his career or the one he hoped to build with Mia. And this time, there was no room for failure. Jake awoke to the sound of his alarm blaring beside the bed, the familiar urgency pulling him from the remnants of a restless sleep. He reached out to silence it, but for a moment, he just lay there, staring at the ceiling. The weight of the decisions he had to make pressed down on him, thicker than the blankets wrapped around his body. The room was still quiet, the only sounds coming from the soft rhythm of Mia's breathing beside him. She was still asleep, her back to him. He hadn't meant to stay up late again, but the problem at work was far from resolved, and the more he worked, the more it seemed like everything else was slipping through his fingers. His phone buzzed from the nightstand. Another email from SpaceX, urgent. Jake groaned inwardly but didn't reach for it immediately. He had promised himself this morning would be different. But as the seconds ticked by, his mind kept drifting back to the looming deadlines, the pressure that seemed to increase by the hour. He couldn't help it. His entire career was on the line, and he knew that every decision mattered. But then Mia's words from last night echoed in his mind. I need to see you putting in the effort, every day, not just when it's convenient. Jake stared at the phone for a moment longer before he finally grabbed it. He quickly scanned the email, feeling his pulse spike with each new request. It wasn't just a simple update. This was serious, his team was encountering a roadblock that could delay the launch by months. He could already hear the angry words of his bosses, the pressure mounting with every tick of the clock. He took a deep breath, trying to quell the gnawing feeling in his stomach. He glanced at Mia again, her peaceful face an image of calm amidst the chaos in his mind. Jake felt a pang of guilt. This was the moment. He couldn't keep doing this, juggling his work and his personal life as if he could somehow avoid the inevitable crash. Just as he was about to reach for the phone again, Mia stirred beside him. Her hand gently brushed against his, and Jake snapped out of his thoughts, realizing just how much he'd been consumed by everything else. Mia's presence brought him back to the here and now. Jake, she murmured, her eyes fluttering open. She blinked a few times as if shaking off sleep, then met his gaze. Are you okay? Jake hesitated, caught between the responsibility of the moment and the need to be honest. Yeah, he said softly, but even he could hear the lie in his voice. He wasn't okay. None of this was okay. But he wasn't ready to admit that to her yet, not when she had already given him so much. Mia sat up slightly, propping herself up on her elbow. You don't look okay, she said, her voice quiet but concerned. What's going on? Jake opened his mouth to say something, but the words caught in his throat. The truth felt too raw. For weeks now, he'd been trying to balance the demands of his job and his relationship, but it was clear that his attempts weren't enough. Every time he worked late or missed a promise, it pushed him further away from Mia. He couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Jake trailed off, running a hand through his hair. I don't know how to do this anymore, Mia. The pressure at work, it's killing me. Every time I think I've got things under control, something else breaks. And I keep pushing you aside to handle it. Mia's eyes softened, and she reached out to take his hand in hers. Jake, she said gently, you don't have to do it alone. But you have to choose. You can't keep living in the middle of this mess and pretending everything is fine. Jake closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words. She was right. The constant juggling, the work always taking precedence over the moments that mattered, he was running on empty. And Mia deserved better than a half-hearted version of him. He'd told her he would change, but every time he tried, something else seemed to pull him back into the chaos. The question loomed over him now, clearer than ever, what was more important, his career or his relationship? Mia's voice broke through his thoughts. Jake, you have to make a choice. You can't keep giving me half of you. You promised me, remember? I need to know you're here, fully here, not just when it's convenient. I know, Jake whispered, his throat tight. I promised. They both sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the conversation hanging between them. Jake squeezed Mia's hand, the tension in his chest becoming almost unbearable. It was clear that Mia wasn't going to wait for him to make a decision. She had already given him more chances than he deserved, and every time he failed, it made the possibility of losing her feel more and more real. Finally, Jake spoke again, his voice shaky but determined. I don't want to lose you, Mia. I don't want to keep making these same mistakes. I've been trying to do everything at once, and I'm starting to see that I can't. I need to pick one thing and commit to it. Mia's gaze softened, but there was still a firmness there, a strength that he admired. And what's it going to be, Jake? What are you going to choose? Jake closed his eyes, the question burning in his chest. He could feel his future unfolding in front of him, the weight of his decision pressing against his ribs. His work at SpaceX had been his dream, something he had worked for his entire life. But Mia. Mia was the one who made him feel whole, who gave his life meaning outside of spreadsheets and deadlines. I choose you, Jake said, finally meeting her eyes. I choose this life with you, Mia. I choose us. Mia's expression softened, but there was a vulnerability in her eyes that he had never seen before. Are you sure, Jake? I need to know you're really ready to put this first. Because I can't keep waiting for you to come around. Jake nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just a decision, it was a commitment. A commitment to be present. A commitment to be the partner Mia deserved. I'm sure, he said, his voice steady now. I've been so focused on proving myself to everyone else, but I realize now that the most important thing is being here for you. I'm ready to make that choice. Mia exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Good, she said softly. That's all I've been asking for. For you to choose us. Jake leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. I'm sorry it took me so long to realize what really matters, but I'm here now. And I won't let go. The relief that washed over him was almost overwhelming. For the first time in months, Jake felt a sense of peace settle within him. He had made his decision. Now, it was time to live up to it. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The next few days after Jake made his decision were an emotional whirlwind. He had promised Mia that he would be present, that he would change, and that he was committed to their future. But despite his resolve, old habits were difficult to shake off. It wasn't that Jake didn't want to follow through on his promise, but he had spent years letting work dictate his life, and the temptation to slip back into those familiar routines was strong. It started on Monday morning. He had spent Sunday with Mia, just as he had promised, taking a short trip out of town. They spent the day hiking, laughing, and simply enjoying each other's company. Jake felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in ages. Mia was right by his side, her hand in his, and for a while, it felt like the world had slowed down to make room for them. It felt real. But Monday was a different story. Jake arrived at SpaceX early, determined to dive into his tasks and stay focused. He was ready to prove that he could balance both his career and his relationship, two worlds that often felt at odds with each other. He had barely sat down at his desk when his phone buzzed. It was an email from the executive team. Subject: Immediate attention needed, urgent issues. Jake sighed and clicked on the message, quickly scanning it. It was a request for him to head into a meeting to discuss the latest setbacks in the project. The issues were piling up faster than he could keep track of, and this was going to be another day of constant pressure. He stared at the screen for a moment, fighting the instinct to dive straight into the work. He could already feel the pull, the desire to fix everything as quickly as possible, to get ahead of the problems. But then he thought of Mia. He had promised her he would be there, that he wouldn't let work consume him. Jake stood up, grabbed his jacket, and left his office. His team needed him, but this time, they'd have to find a way to solve things without him for a few hours. He wasn't about to make the same mistake again. At lunchtime, Jake called Mia, hoping to hear her voice. They hadn't spoken much that morning, and a part of him wanted to be sure that he was keeping his promise, even if it was just a small gesture. "Hey," Mia answered on the third ring, her voice warm but slightly distracted. "Hey," Jake replied, smiling despite the stress of the day. "How's your day going?" Mia's voice softened. "It's good, just the usual. Work's busy. But I was thinking about you." Jake's heart lifted. "Yeah? What about me?" "I just wanted to check in. How are you holding up? I know things are crazy at work, but I need to know you're doing okay. That you're taking care of yourself." Jake felt a lump in his throat. Mia's concern made him feel guilty, but it also reminded him of how lucky he was to have her in his life. She had always been his support, his anchor. And now, he had to return the favor. "I'm doing okay," he said, his voice steady. "It's a lot, but I'm handling it. I'm keeping my promise, Mia. I'll be better about being present." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a brief moment, Jake feared that Mia would question him, wondering if he was being honest. But then, her voice came through, reassuring and calm. "I know you will. And I'm proud of you for trying," she said. "But remember, it's not just about being here physically. It's about being here mentally too. I need you to show up, Jake. Really show up." The words stung, but they were exactly what he needed to hear. He had been half in, half out for so long. It was time to be all in. "I will. I swear," he promised, feeling the weight of his commitment sink in. "I'm doing this for us, Mia." The afternoon passed in a blur of meetings, emails, and phone calls. The pressure to perform was unrelenting, and as the hours ticked by, Jake found himself fighting an internal battle. His mind kept drifting to Mia, to the promise he had made to her. He'd never been one to back down from a challenge. But this was different. This wasn't about being the best at his job, it was about finding balance, about being present for the people who mattered most. For Mia. By the time he left the office that evening, Jake was exhausted. The entire day had felt like a test, and he was beginning to question if he was really capable of living up to his own expectations. He didn't want to disappoint Mia again. He couldn't. When he walked through the door of their apartment, the familiar scent of Mia's cooking hit him immediately. She was in the kitchen, humming a soft tune as she stirred something on the stove. Jake leaned against the doorframe, watching her for a moment. She was beautiful, calm, and grounded. Everything that he was still trying to be. She turned around when she heard his footsteps. "Hey, you're home early," she said, her face lighting up with a smile. Jake smiled back, but there was an underlying tension in his expression. "Yeah, I made it out of there a bit earlier than usual," he said. "I thought I'd have some time to relax tonight." "Good," Mia said. "I've been thinking a lot about our talk, Jake. And I just want you to know that I'm here for you. I want this to work. But you have to meet me halfway. It can't just be all on me." Jake nodded, feeling a knot form in his stomach. "I know. And I will. I'm not going to let you down again, Mia." The evening passed in a comfortable silence. Jake tried to be present, to focus on the here and now. They ate dinner together, laughed over silly stories from their day, and simply enjoyed each other's company. For a brief moment, everything felt right again. But deep down, Jake knew that this was just the beginning. He had made a commitment, but now he had to prove it, not just to Mia, but to himself as well. Every day would be a test, and there would be obstacles along the way. But he was ready to face them. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the weight of his decision was steadily growing heavier, pulling him in different directions. Each day, he fought harder to stay true to his promise to Mia. He wanted to be the partner she deserved, but the pressure of his job was unrelenting, constantly encroaching on the space he had carved out for their relationship. And now, with a critical project at work hanging in the balance, the strain was beginning to show. It was another early morning at SpaceX. Jake arrived at the office at 6:30 a.m., as he had for the past week, knowing full well that this would be a day like no other. The team was behind on the project, and a new series of complications had emerged that demanded immediate action. His phone buzzed on his desk, another email from the higher-ups. The message was short, blunt, and urgent. "We need results, Jake. Get it done." Jake's stomach dropped. He had been so close to wrapping things up, but it seemed as though every time he took a step forward, something knocked him back. This email was just the latest in a long string of messages that demanded more than he had to give. The tone was harsh, the expectations crushing. As the day stretched on, Jake's mind wandered back to Mia. They had made so many plans for the weekend, plans to finally have a day to themselves without the interference of work. But with the growing urgency at the office, Jake knew that he would have to cancel. Again. Later that evening, as the sun began to set and the fluorescent lights in the office flickered overhead, Jake sat in front of his computer, his eyes bloodshot from hours of staring at screens and tackling problem after problem. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Mia. "Are you still coming home tonight?" Jake hesitated. The guilt gnawed at him. The last time they had talked, he had promised he would be home early tonight, no more late nights, no more work creeping into their time together. He had promised. But as the minutes ticked by, Jake found himself unable to tear himself away. There was always one more thing to do, one more call to make, one more problem to solve. He typed a quick reply. "I'm sorry, Mia. It's just, one more thing I need to wrap up." He stared at the screen for a moment longer, but before he could second-guess himself, the phone buzzed again. This time, Mia's reply hit him like a punch to the gut. "Jake, you promised. I thought this was the night. What's going on?" Jake felt his chest tighten. The familiar sense of helplessness surged inside him. He had let her down again. The words he had said to her just a few days ago felt hollow now, as though they had never left his lips at all. He knew he couldn't keep doing this, not without consequences. Before he could respond, another message came through, this time from his manager at work. "Jake, we need a solution by tomorrow morning. We're counting on you." The weight of it all, the demands from work, the promises he had broken to Mia, felt unbearable. His head was spinning, and for a moment, everything seemed to blur together. He could feel the walls closing in around him, and his throat tightened. He couldn't take it anymore. By the time Jake finally left the office, it was well past midnight. He was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained. He hadn't eaten in hours, and the weight of his decisions sat heavily on his shoulders. As he drove home, his mind replayed the evening's events. Mia's face when she sent the message, her disappointment, her hurt. It stung far more than any reprimand from work ever could. When Jake stepped through the door of their apartment, the silence hit him like a freight train. Mia wasn't in the living room, where she usually sat, waiting for him to come home. He walked into the bedroom, half expecting to see her there, but the bed was empty. His heart sank. He found her in the kitchen, sitting at the small table with a cup of tea in front of her. Her posture was stiff, and her eyes were distant. She hadn't even looked up when he walked in. "Mia?" Jake said, his voice quiet. She looked up at him, and Jake could see the sadness in her eyes, a sadness he knew he had caused. "Jake," she began, her voice soft but firm. "We need to talk." Jake's throat went dry. He had known this moment was coming, but it didn't make it any easier to face. "I can't keep doing this, Jake," Mia continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been patient, and I've given you so many chances, but you keep choosing your work over us. Over me. And I can't keep waiting around for you to figure it out. Jake felt his heart break. He opened his mouth to respond, to apologize, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain what he was feeling? He had tried, so hard, but it never seemed to be enough. I don't know what to say, Mia, he whispered. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I've been trying, but every time I think I've found a balance, it all falls apart again. Mia stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. She walked over to where Jake stood, but instead of offering comfort, she kept a distance. Jake, I've been waiting for you to choose. And it feels like every time I need you, you're just not here. I can't keep living like this. I can't keep asking you for things that should come naturally, things like time, affection, commitment. Jake's breath hitched in his chest. Mia, please. I'm here. I'm trying. You have to believe me. But Mia shook her head. I want to believe you, Jake. But I can't keep believing in someone who keeps breaking promises. There was a long, painful silence between them. Jake wanted to say something, anything, to fix this, but the words felt inadequate. What could he say? What could he do? I need to think, Mia said quietly, turning away from him. I need some space. Jake watched her retreat into the other room, his heart shattering into 1,000 pieces. He had lost her. It was only a matter of time now. Jake spent the entire night in a daze, unable to shake the image of Mia turning away from him. The conversation had been the hardest one he'd ever had, and as he lay in their empty bed, every word she said echoed in his mind. It was all too much. He had been so focused on work, so consumed by his goals, that he hadn't realized what he was losing. Mia had given him everything, her love, her patience, her trust. And he had been taking it for granted, letting the very thing that mattered most slip through his fingers. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, and Jake found himself staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. He had never felt so powerless. Every part of his body screamed for him to fix this, to find a way back to her, but he didn't know how. He didn't know how to go back to the promises he made, how to undo the hurt he had caused. At the break of dawn, he finally dragged himself out of bed, pulling on his clothes without thinking. The urge to make things right was burning in his chest, but it was more than that. He was terrified of losing her. He couldn't imagine his life without Mia in it. But he knew that if he was ever going to have a chance at redemption, he had to face the truth of what he had done. When he got to the office, the chaos was already in full swing. Jake knew the project's deadline was approaching, and everyone was scrambling to get things back on track. But as he stepped through the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The stress of his personal life was weighing on him, making it hard to concentrate. He could barely focus on the numbers on the screen in front of him. A knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. Jake. It was Carlos, his right-hand man. We've got a problem with the supplier. We need you in the meeting now. Jake sighed and rubbed his temples. His thoughts were still clouded by the argument with Mia. But he couldn't let that stop him from doing his job. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. Yeah, I'll be there in a minute, Jake said, his voice hollow. Carlos left, but Jake didn't move. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but he didn't type a single word. His thoughts kept drifting back to Mia. He could feel the weight of her disappointment, the way she had looked at him last night, like he wasn't the man she fell in love with anymore. He needed to fix it, but how? As the day wore on, Jake felt like he was living in two separate worlds. At work, he was juggling meetings, emails, and problem-solving with all the energy he could muster, but his mind kept wandering back to Mia. Every time he heard someone mention a deadline or a project milestone, all he could think about was the conversation they had last night. Mia was right. He had made so many promises to her, and he had broken them. He hadn't even realized how far he had drifted from her, how much he had neglected their relationship. Around noon, as Jake sat in a meeting discussing potential solutions for the supply chain issue, his phone buzzed. He looked down at it, hoping it was Mia, but instead, it was a message from his assistant. "Jake, urgent call from Elon. He needs you in his office ASAP." Jake's stomach tightened. It wasn't often that Elon personally requested him, and he knew it was a big deal whenever that happened. He stood up quickly, excusing himself from the meeting, and made his way to Elon's office. As he walked down the hallway, his mind was a whirlwind. What could Elon possibly want? And why now, of all times? When Jake entered Elon's office, the atmosphere was tense. Elon was sitting at his desk, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a look of seriousness that Jake had rarely seen. "Jake," Elon said, his voice low. "Sit down." Jake took a seat across from him, suddenly feeling the weight of the situation pressing on him. Elon didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I've been keeping an eye on your work recently," Elon began. "You've been performing well, but I've noticed something. You're distracted. You're not the same leader you were when you first joined this company." Jake swallowed hard. The words stung, but they were true. He had been distracted. He had let his work consume him to the point where he couldn't see the bigger picture anymore. He had let the most important things slip through his fingers. "I've been dealing with some personal issues," Jake admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not focused like I should be." Elon nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "I can tell. And here's the thing, Jake, this company needs leaders who are all in. Who are present. If you're going to lead a team, you have to lead yourself first." Jake felt a lump in his throat. "I understand. I've been making mistakes. I've been trying to balance everything, but I haven't been succeeding." Elon studied him for a moment before speaking again. "You've got the potential, Jake. But you need to find a way to balance your life. If you don't, it's going to affect your work, and it's going to affect the people around you. You're not just a part of this team, you're a key player. But if your personal life is taking you off course, you're not going to be able to contribute to the team's success the way we need you to." Jake nodded, absorbing every word. It was like a wake-up call. He had been so wrapped up in the chaos of his work that he hadn't even seen how much it was affecting everything else. Elon was right. He needed to get his act together, or he would lose everything, his career, his team, and the one person who meant the most to him. "Thank you, Elon," Jake said quietly. "I needed to hear that." Elon gave him a sharp nod. "I'm not telling you to quit your job or give up everything you're working for, Jake. But I am telling you that you need to find a way to get your priorities straight. You have to choose what matters most." Jake left Elon's office feeling more conflicted than ever. But one thing was clear, he had a decision to make. And it wasn't going to be easy. That night, Jake came home late again. He was physically and mentally drained, but he couldn't ignore the conversation he had had with Elon. It was time to make a choice. He found Mia in the living room, sitting on the couch, her eyes focused on her phone. When she looked up, she saw the serious expression on his face. "Mia," Jake said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I know I've hurt you. And I know I've broken promises. I've been so focused on work that I didn't even see how much I was losing in the process. But I'm ready to change. I'm ready to do whatever it takes to prove to you that I can be the man you need." Mia looked at him, her expression guarded but hopeful. "Jake. You can't just say that. You have to show me. You have to prove it." Jake nodded, determination flooding his chest. "I will. I promise. I'm going to fix this. I'm going to make things right." The next few days were a whirlwind. Jake had made the commitment to change, but the reality of what that meant began to sink in. It wasn't enough to just say the words. He had to show Mia, and himself, that he could be the man she needed, the man who wouldn't let his ambitions drown out the love they shared. Every morning, Jake woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. He still had the same work responsibilities, the same deadlines to meet, but now he approached each day with a different mindset. He didn't let the emails pile up before responding, and he started scheduling time to focus on his personal life. He made a point to leave the office at a reasonable hour, even if it meant staying late to catch up on unfinished work later. He made small, deliberate changes, ones that felt sustainable. But the biggest challenge was still at home, Mia. Every time he thought he was getting closer to fixing things between them, he found himself unsure of what to say, unsure of how to prove himself. He had broken her trust, and while she was willing to give him a chance, the road to rebuilding that trust was long and uncertain. One evening, Jake came home early. He had just finished a major meeting that had drained him, but there was something he needed to do. He wanted to show Mia that he was taking the necessary steps, that he wasn't just going to sit back and hope things would work out. When he walked into the living room, Mia was sitting on the couch, reading a book. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. "Hey," Jake said, his voice tentative. "Hey," Mia replied, her tone distant, though not unkind. Jake sat down next to her, his heart pounding in his chest. "I've been thinking a lot about everything we talked about. About the promises I've made, and broken, and what I need to do to fix it. I don't want to keep letting you down, Mia. I can't lose you." Mia closed her book, her eyes softening slightly as she looked at him. "I'm not going anywhere, Jake. But you have to show me that this isn't just a phase. That this is real. I need to see that you're committed, not just to your work, but to us." Jake nodded, his throat tight. "I'm ready to prove it to you. I'm ready to change. I know I've messed up, but I'm not giving up on us." Mia studied him for a moment before speaking again. "You've got a lot to prove, Jake. It's not just about staying late for dinner or being home at a decent hour. It's about being present. Emotionally, mentally. You have to be here, not just physically." Jake felt the weight of her words. She was right. He had been so focused on the external, on meeting deadlines and putting out fires at work, that he had neglected the emotional part of their relationship, the part that kept them connected. "I understand," Jake said quietly. "I've been thinking about that. I've realized that I can't just show up and expect things to be okay. I need to be there for you, for us." Mia looked down, her fingers absently tracing the edge of her book. "I just don't want to keep waiting for something to change, Jake. I need to know that this time will be different." Jake reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "I know. And I'm not asking you to wait forever. But I need you to give me a chance to show you that I can change. That I can be the partner you deserve." Mia exhaled slowly, her gaze softening as she met his eyes. "I'll give you that chance. But you have to understand that this won't be easy. It's going to take time." "I'm willing to put in the work," Jake replied, his voice filled with conviction. "I promise." The next few weeks were a test of Jake's resolve. He made changes to his routine, putting his phone on silent when he was with Mia and making sure they spent quality time together. He even cut back on unnecessary meetings and delegated tasks that could be handled by others, knowing that his time at home was more important than any work project. But it wasn't just about his actions, it was about his mindset. He began to look at his career not as a competition for success, but as a way to contribute to something greater. He started finding more balance in his life, creating space for his relationship with Mia while still staying committed to his professional responsibilities. And it was working. Slowly but surely, Mia began to soften. She could see the effort Jake was putting in, and although the scars from the past were still fresh, she could see glimpses of the man she had fallen in love with. One evening, as they sat on the couch, watching an old movie they had watched together early in their relationship, Jake turned to Mia, his heart full. "You know, I've been thinking about something," he said quietly. Mia glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "What's that?" Jake smiled, his eyes warm. I've been thinking about our future. About what we want to do together. I know I've been so focused on the future at work that I haven't stopped to think about the future we could have together. Mia's heart fluttered in her chest. She had heard Jake talk about the future before, but this time, there was something different in his voice. Something real. What do you mean? She asked softly. I mean, I want to be a part of your future, Mia. I want to build something with you. I've been so focused on my career that I didn't realize I was missing out on the most important thing in my life. Mia looked at him for a long moment, her heart torn between hope and caution. But as she met his gaze, she saw the sincerity in his eyes. She could feel it in the way he was looking at her, the way his hand gently brushed against hers. I want that too, Jake, Mia whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I want us to build something together. But you have to keep showing me that you're here. I will, Jake promised, his voice filled with certainty. I'll keep showing you. Every day. And for the first time in a long time, Mia allowed herself to believe him. Days turned into weeks, and Jake's commitment to Mia was put to the test in ways he never expected. On the outside, everything seemed to be falling into place, his professional life was starting to find its rhythm again, and he and Mia were spending more time together, rekindling the connection they once shared. But internally, the pressure was mounting. Jake knew that although things were better, the real challenge was yet to come. As much as he had promised to change, the demands of his job were never far behind. Every time he thought he could take a breather, another urgent issue at work would pop up. The project deadlines, the constant meetings, the high expectations, it was a relentless cycle that pulled at him, reminding him of the struggle for balance he had yet to master. Mia had noticed this too. Although she appreciated his efforts, there were moments when she felt like she was losing him again. She hadn't asked him to abandon his work, but she needed him to show up, to be present in their life together, not just physically, but emotionally as well. It was the first Friday night in weeks that Jake wasn't buried in a pile of paperwork. He had promised Mia they would have a quiet evening together, a rare chance to reconnect. But as they sat on the couch, watching a movie, Jake's phone buzzed on the coffee table. He glanced at it instinctively, and his heart sank. It was a message from his team. Jake, we need your approval on the final report. It's critical for tomorrow's meeting. Mia didn't say anything, but Jake could feel the tension in the air. She didn't even look at him, her eyes stayed fixed on the TV screen, her silence louder than any words she could have spoken. I'm sorry, Jake said, his voice low. I just need to respond to this quickly. Mia finally looked at him, her expression guarded. You're always just doing something, Jake. It's always one more thing. And I'm left here waiting. Jake's chest tightened. He had heard the disappointment in her voice before, but this time, it hit harder. This wasn't about the work, it was about the message he was sending. He had promised her he would be different, yet here he was again, prioritizing his work over their time together. I know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, Mia. I don't want to keep doing this to you. Mia sighed, setting the remote down beside her. I'm not asking you to give up your career, Jake. I just need to know that when I'm with you, I have your full attention. I need to feel like I matter. Like I'm not just some side note in your life. Jake swallowed hard, his emotions a tangle of frustration, guilt, and regret. He wanted to make her understand. He wasn't doing this because he didn't care, he was doing it because he thought it was the only way to succeed. But now, as Mia sat in front of him, hurt in her eyes, he realized that no amount of success in the world could replace her. I get it, Jake said softly. I've been so focused on proving myself, on doing everything right at work, that I've neglected what really matters. I've been doing it all wrong. Mia's eyes softened, though there was still a layer of sadness in her gaze. I just need you to be here, Jake. To be here with me. We've been through too much for you to keep putting everything else first. Jake's heart ached. He had been so blind. He had been running in circles, trying to chase a future that didn't even matter if he didn't have her in it. I promise you, Mia, he said, taking her hand gently, from now on, I'm here. I'm not going to keep letting this happen. You and I, this is what matters. I'll find a way to balance it. Mia looked at him, her eyes searching his face for the sincerity she so desperately needed to see. After a long moment, she nodded slowly. I want to believe you, Jake, she said, her voice soft, but hesitant. But words aren't enough anymore. You have to show me. Every day. That's the only way. Jake squeezed her hand, a wave of determination flooding his chest. He had let her down so many times, but this time, he wasn't going to fail. He was going to show her that he was willing to fight for their future, no matter the cost. The next morning, Jake woke up early, determined to make good on his promise to Mia. He had a busy day ahead, but he knew that his relationship with her had to come first. He took a few minutes to breathe, focusing on the changes he had to make, not just for her, but for himself. He needed to break free from the cycle of workaholism that had taken over his life. He couldn't be the partner Mia deserved if he kept pushing her aside for the sake of his career. He walked into the kitchen, where Mia was sitting at the table, her coffee mug in hand. She looked up as he entered, offering a small smile, but Jake could tell that there was still a lot of uncertainty between them. Hey, he said gently, sitting down across from her. I was thinking, how about we take the weekend off? No work, no distractions. Just you and me. Mia raised an eyebrow. Just like that? Yeah, Jake said with a smile, though he felt a little unsure of himself. I know it's not going to fix everything, but I want to start somewhere. I want to prove to you that I can be here for you, completely. Mia studied him for a moment, and then she nodded. Okay. But this time, Jake, I'm not going to keep waiting around. If you say you're going to change, you have to show me. Jake nodded firmly, a new sense of clarity in his eyes. I will. I promise. And just like that, a small spark of hope ignited between them. Jake knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to take the first steps. He had already started changing, but now, it was time to prove it to Mia, one moment at a time. As the weekend unfolded, Jake made every effort to be fully present with Mia. They went on long walks, talked about things they hadn't in months, and rediscovered the joy of simply being together without the distractions of work or responsibilities. He didn't check his phone constantly or sneak off to take calls, he was there with her, in the moment. Mia could feel the difference. It wasn't just about the time they were spending together, it was about the quality of that time. It was real. It was tangible. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like the priority she had always wanted to be. Jake was showing her, through his actions, that he was ready to make their relationship a priority. And with every passing day, Mia began to trust him a little more. Jake felt a sense of relief that weekend, but as Monday morning rolled around, the reality of his situation started to settle in once more. Balancing work and his relationship with Mia was going to be more difficult than he had anticipated. But the promise he made to Mia was still fresh in his mind, he would make this work. No matter what. He arrived at the office early, trying to get a jump on the day. The project he'd been working on for weeks was coming to a head, and there were several decisions that needed his immediate attention. The pressure felt intense, but Jake was determined not to let it overwhelm him. He started by organizing his tasks, making sure he left room in his schedule for the things that mattered most, like time with Mia. But as the hours ticked by, Jake's resolve began to falter. One phone call after another came in, each one more urgent than the last. Soon, his inbox was flooded, and he found himself falling back into his old habits of staying later at the office, juggling multiple projects at once. The work was consuming him again, and despite his promises, Mia was being pushed to the back burner. Around lunchtime, Jake's phone buzzed on his desk. He picked it up, and for a moment, his heart sank as he saw Mia's name flash across the screen. "Are you coming home soon? We were supposed to have dinner together tonight." He knew instantly that she was feeling neglected. His stomach twisted with guilt, but as he began to reply, another message popped up from his team, needing his attention immediately. He looked at his phone, torn between the two, but his finger hovered over the keyboard. After a long pause, he finally typed. "I'm sorry, Mia. I'll be home as soon as I can. I have to finish some urgent work, but I'll make it up to you." He sent the message and immediately regretted it. He knew he had let her down again. At home that evening, the atmosphere between Jake and Mia was thick with tension. Mia sat on the couch, arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the TV, but her thoughts were miles away. Jake entered the living room, his briefcase in hand, and the look on Mia's face immediately stopped him in his tracks. "Mia," he said softly, walking toward her. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to keep you waiting. I got caught up at work again, but I promise, I'll do better." Mia didn't respond immediately. She was hurt, and the hurt was apparent in the way she kept her distance. "Jake," she said after a moment, her voice quiet but firm. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You say you'll change, but then you slip right back into the same old patterns. You keep pushing me aside, and I'm tired of it." Jake stood there, feeling the weight of her words press down on him. She wasn't wrong. He had promised to do better, and yet here he was again, letting his work take priority over her. The pattern was too familiar, and for the first time in weeks, Jake felt truly defeated. "Mia, he trailed off, unsure of what to say. He had made a commitment, but the constant pressure at work was making it feel impossible to keep that promise. "I don't know how to fix this. Every time I try to be better, something else comes up, and I end up losing track of what's important." Mia stood up, her voice steady but full of pain. "I can't keep doing this, Jake. I can't keep being second place in your life. I need someone who can be there for me, who knows how to prioritize what matters. And right now, it feels like work is always going to come first." Jake's heart shattered. He had always thought of himself as a hard worker, someone who would go to great lengths to provide and succeed, but now he understood. He had been sacrificing the very thing he was trying to build, a future with Mia, for the wrong reasons. The thought of losing her was unbearable. "I never wanted to make you feel like you're not important, Mia. You are. You're everything to me," Jake said, his voice cracking. "But I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to balance everything." Mia shook her head, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "Maybe it's not about balancing everything. Maybe it's about choosing what matters most. And right now, Jake, I don't feel like I'm your priority." Jake's throat tightened, and he swallowed hard, trying to push back the tears that were threatening to surface. "Please don't say that. I'm trying so hard." Mia stepped closer to him, her expression softening. "I know you are, Jake. But sometimes trying isn't enough. You need to show me, not just tell me. I can't keep waiting for you to make the right choice." There was a long silence as Jake processed her words. For the first time, he realized that Mia wasn't just asking for his attention. She was asking for his commitment, for his full presence. She was asking for a partner, someone who could stand by her side, not someone who was always looking over their shoulder at the next big thing. Later that evening, Jake took a long walk outside to clear his mind. The cool air bit at his skin, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the internal struggle he felt. Mia was right. He had been too caught up in the hustle to notice the damage it was causing. Work had become a refuge for him, a way to prove something to himself, but in doing so, he had lost sight of what was truly important, the people he loved. As he walked, he thought about the future he wanted. He thought about Mia and how much she meant to him. It wasn't just about proving his worth in the boardroom, it was about showing up for her, for their relationship, every single day. By the time Jake returned home, the tension between him and Mia had not eased. But he knew what he had to do. He walked into the living room, took a deep breath, and said, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. And I realize that I've been failing you. I've been failing us." Mia looked up at him, her expression a mix of caution and hope. "Jake. I need to make a choice," Jake continued, his voice steady. "I've been treating work like it's the only thing that matters, but you're right, it's not. What matters is us. You. I need to start living like that, not just talking about it." Mia's eyes softened as she listened. "It's going to take time, Jake. But I'm willing to see if we can make this work. If you're truly ready to choose us." Jake nodded, his resolve stronger than ever. "I am. I choose you, Mia. I choose us." Jake's commitment to Mia was now clear, but the journey toward balance was far from simple. The decision he had made to prioritize his relationship over his career was not something that could be changed overnight. Every day, Jake faced the pressure of both his demanding job and his desire to be the partner Mia needed. But no matter how hard he tried to manage both, the balance between his professional responsibilities and his personal life felt like a constantly shifting equation. It was a Wednesday morning when Jake first realized just how difficult this would be. He had woken up early to spend a few quiet moments with Mia before the chaos of the day took over. The sun had barely risen, and he and Mia sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and sharing a calm silence. It was moments like these that reminded Jake why he was making this effort, to keep this connection strong, to nourish it with the kind of attention it deserved. But as they sat there, his phone buzzed on the table. Without thinking, Jake glanced at the screen. His stomach tightened when he saw the message, a request for an urgent conference call with his team. He knew immediately that this would consume the next several hours of his morning. Mia noticed the shift in his demeanor, the way he stiffened at the sight of his phone. "Another emergency?" she asked, her voice laced with a mixture of weariness and understanding. Jake let out a deep sigh, his fingers hovering over the phone. "I'm afraid so," he admitted. "This is one of those moments where I really need to take this. But I'll be back as soon as I can." Mia's eyes softened, but she didn't say anything right away. She simply nodded. "I understand," she said quietly. "But I just hope that when this is all over, you'll remember what you're fighting for." Jake's heart sank. He knew what she meant. It wasn't just about the work, it was about being there for her, for them. It was about showing up and proving that Mia mattered more than all the meetings and deadlines. "I will," Jake said, though a part of him doubted his ability to follow through. The weight of his responsibilities pressed on him like an invisible burden. How could he possibly make Mia feel like a priority when work seemed to demand his attention at every turn? The day spiraled faster than Jake expected. He found himself on call after call, facing one challenge after another. He tried to keep it all together, checking in with Mia, offering brief apologies when he had to cancel plans, and promising to make up for lost time. But with each passing hour, the emotional toll was building, not just on him, but on his relationship with Mia as well. By the time he finally left the office that evening, Jake was mentally exhausted. He had hoped to keep his word, but the reality of his workload had completely overwhelmed him. As he walked into their apartment, he found Mia sitting on the couch, her legs tucked underneath her, eyes trained on the TV but clearly distant. "Mia?" Jake's voice was tentative as he stepped into the room. She turned to him, offering a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hey. How was your day?" Jake sat down beside her, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I'm sorry, Mia. I didn't mean for this to happen. But it got out of hand. I wanted to be here with you." Mia sighed and set the remote down, turning toward him. "Jake, this has been happening for weeks now. You keep telling me you're going to change, that you're going to make time for us, but it's always the same thing. The work, the deadlines, the meetings. I don't feel like I'm your priority anymore. Jake's chest tightened. I know. I know I've been falling short. But I don't know how to stop it. Work keeps pulling me back in, and every time I think I can make time for you, something else comes up. Mia looked at him, her expression soft but firm. I get it, Jake. I really do. But it can't keep going on like this. I'm not asking you to quit your job or give up everything you've worked for. I'm asking you to make time for us, for me, even when things are busy. I can't keep waiting for you to choose us when everything else gets in the way. Jake took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words sink in. I don't know how to fix this. I really don't. I've been trying, Mia. But I keep failing. Mia's voice softened, a mixture of frustration and longing in her eyes. I just need to see that you're committed to making it work. That when you say you're going to choose me, you actually do. Jake swallowed hard. The silence that followed was heavy, and for a moment, it felt like the whole world was pressing in on him. He had thought he could handle it all, work, Mia, and everything in between, but now, the reality of his situation hit him like a brick wall. He wasn't as strong as he thought. And the one person who had always been there for him was the one he was in danger of losing. The next morning, Jake woke up with a renewed sense of determination. He was at a crossroads, he couldn't keep letting work control his life. He had to make a change, not just for Mia, but for himself. He couldn't allow himself to be defined by his job anymore. There had to be more to life than just deadlines and meetings. There had to be more than the never-ending pursuit of success. After Mia had left for work, Jake sat down at his desk, staring at the cluttered pile of emails and tasks in front of him. He felt overwhelmed, but instead of diving into it, he took a moment to pause. This time, he wasn't going to tackle everything at once. He needed to prioritize, starting with the most important thing, Mia. He took a deep breath, picked up his phone, and called his assistant. I need to clear my schedule for the next few days, Jake said. I have some personal things I need to focus on. He hung up the phone, a small sense of relief washing over him. He knew the decision wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be perfect, but it was a start. For the first time in a long time, he was choosing to take control of his own life, not letting the demands of work dictate his every move. Later that day, Jake met Mia at a small cafe, one they used to frequent when things were simpler. Mia raised an eyebrow when she saw him sitting at the table, a serious expression on his face. What's going on? She asked, sitting down across from him. I've made some decisions, Jake began, his voice steady but full of conviction. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, and about what I've been doing wrong. I've realized that I can't keep doing this. Work can't always come first. I'm not going to let it anymore. Mia's eyes widened, and she searched his face, looking for any sign that this wasn't just another empty promise. I've cleared my schedule, Jake continued. For the next few days, I'm focused on us. I want to prove to you that I'm serious about making time for you. About making you my priority. Mia sat there, stunned for a moment. Then, her face softened, and she reached out to take his hand. You don't know how much that means to me, Jake, she said, her voice shaking slightly. But it's not just about the time you spend. It's about showing me that you're fully here, that you're committed. I want to feel like I'm not just an afterthought. Jake nodded, a deep sense of clarity settling over him. You won't be. I promise. The days that followed Jake's decision to prioritize Mia over work were a delicate balancing act. Jake threw himself into his personal life with a new sense of urgency and determination, eager to prove that he could keep his promises. He canceled meetings, rescheduled calls, and made sure that his phone was kept in his pocket during dinner and dates. For the first time in months, he felt like he was fully present in his relationship, but the road ahead was far from smooth. Mia, for her part, was cautiously optimistic. She appreciated Jake's efforts, there was no doubt about that. But the hurt from the past few weeks, the feeling of being pushed aside, was not so easily erased. Every time Jake would get caught up in a moment at work, every time the phone buzzed with an email or a reminder, Mia couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creeping in. She loved him, of course, but could she trust that he would truly change? Could she believe in his words without seeing more than just temporary gestures? She had no choice but to wait, to watch, and to see if Jake would continue to stay committed to his promise. It was Friday afternoon when Jake came to a difficult realization. He had been sitting in the park, his feet propped up on a bench, trying to enjoy the time he'd carved out for himself. Mia was busy with work that day, and for the first time in a while, Jake had a rare moment of solitude. He had been spending his days with Mia, taking walks, going to dinner, enjoying each other's company, but he realized that it wasn't enough just to be present. There was more to rebuilding their relationship than simply showing up. Jake knew this was the moment. He couldn't keep walking on eggshells, afraid of messing things up again. He needed to dive deeper into the reasons why he had put work before her in the first place. He needed to understand the root of the problem and figure out how he could fix it, for good. So, he called a meeting with himself. No distractions, no excuses. He sat in his apartment later that evening, surrounded by the quiet hum of the city outside, and asked himself the tough questions. Why had he prioritized work? The answer wasn't simple. He had always been driven, ambitious, and hungry for success. In his mind, work equaled validation. It was how he defined his worth. But in doing so, he had missed the most important thing in his life, Mia. She wasn't asking for his success or his time at the office, she was asking for his heart, his attention, and his commitment to them as a couple. The more Jake reflected, the clearer it became. He wasn't just working for success anymore, he was working to prove something to himself that he didn't need to prove. And in doing so, he had hurt the one person who mattered most. When Mia arrived home later that night, Jake was waiting for her. His expression was serious, but there was a soft vulnerability in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. Mia, I've been doing a lot of thinking, he said, his voice low and steady. I know I've made mistakes. I've promised you change, and I've tried, but I can't keep promising without fully understanding why I've been failing you. Mia set down her bag, her gaze locking with his. Jake, what are you trying to say? I've been using work as an excuse, he continued. I've been chasing success because it makes me feel validated. But I realize now that I've been running from something more important, our relationship. I've been trying to prove to myself that I'm enough, that I can be successful and provide, but in doing so, I've neglected you. And I'm sorry. I can't keep pretending that this is enough. You deserve more. Mia's expression softened as she listened. For the first time in weeks, she could see the sincerity in his eyes. She could feel the weight of his words, and it was a moment that touched her deeply. I'm not asking you to give up everything, Jake, she said quietly. But I need you to make me a priority. To show me that I'm not just an afterthought. I need to feel like you're truly here, emotionally, not just physically. Jake nodded. I hear you. And I'm ready to prove it. I want to be here for you, Mia. And I'll do whatever it takes to show you that. There was a brief pause as Mia processed his words. She didn't respond immediately, but there was a shift in her demeanor. She could feel Jake's sincerity, and for the first time in a while, she believed him. I'm willing to try again, she said softly. But this time, we both have to be all in. Jake smiled, his chest lifting with hope. I'm all in, Mia. I promise. The next few weeks were a turning point for both of them. Mia and Jake began to rebuild their relationship on a foundation of honest communication and mutual understanding. Jake took steps to ensure that work no longer overshadowed his personal life. He set boundaries with his team, dedicated his weekends to spending time with Mia, and made a conscious effort to be more emotionally present. But it wasn't just about Jake's actions, it was about Mia's willingness to trust him again. It was about her opening up to him and allowing him to prove that he could be the partner she needed. They began to create new memories together, free from the cloud of uncertainty that had hung over them for so long. They traveled to nearby cities on weekends, attended family gatherings, and shared quiet nights at home. Slowly but surely, their connection deepened. They laughed more, talked about their dreams and fears, and learned to appreciate the small moments in life that often went unnoticed. However, rebuilding trust wasn't without its challenges. There were moments when Mia would still feel the sting of past disappointments, moments when Jake's old habits would resurface. But each time, they faced it together, communicating openly and honestly. They learned that love wasn't just about grand gestures, it was about the quiet commitment to choose each other, day after day. One evening, as Jake and Mia sat together in their living room, their fingers intertwined, Mia turned to him with a soft smile. "You know, I never thought we'd get here," she said quietly. "After everything, I wasn't sure we could make it. But here we are." Jake squeezed her hand, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I'm so glad we did. I don't ever want to go back to the way things were." Mia leaned her head on his shoulder, her voice barely a whisper. "Neither do I." And in that moment, Jake realized that the true success in his life wasn't defined by numbers or accolades. It was defined by the love he shared with Mia, the trust they had rebuilt, and the promise that no matter what came next, they would face it together. As the months passed, Jake and Mia's relationship blossomed into something stronger than either of them could have imagined. The hurdles they had faced together had only strengthened their bond, and both were committed to keeping that connection alive. However, life wasn't going to stop testing them. Just when they thought they had found their rhythm, new challenges appeared, proving that even the most solid foundations require constant care. It started with a phone call that disrupted Jake's quiet evening at home. He had just finished dinner with Mia, and they were on the couch, wrapped in the kind of contented silence that comes after a shared meal. Jake's phone rang, and he immediately recognized the number. It was his boss, Carlos. "Jake," Carlos said, his voice tinged with urgency. "We've just received a major proposal, and I need you to handle it. It's a huge opportunity for the company, but we need to move quickly. I'm counting on you." Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. The pressure was mounting again. He had just begun to believe that his life could return to some semblance of balance. But the familiar weight of his job was pulling him back into its grasp. "Carlos, I just got back from a business trip last week. I've been trying to take some time off to focus on my personal life," Jake said, trying to sound firm but knowing how weak it might come across. Carlos didn't miss a beat. "I understand, but this is important. I know you're committed to your relationship, but you also have a responsibility to this company. Think about the bigger picture." Jake looked over at Mia, who had been listening quietly from across the room. Her eyes were soft but serious, and Jake knew she understood the dilemma. She had witnessed his struggle between work and their relationship too many times before. The question was, how long could this balance last? How many times could he promise that he was done before his work once again overshadowed the life they were building together? "I'll do it," Jake said, the words slipping out before he had fully processed the consequences. He didn't want to disappoint Mia, but at the same time, he felt the weight of his responsibilities. Carlos let out a relieved sigh. "Thanks, Jake. I knew I could count on you. I'll have the details sent over to you tomorrow." As soon as the call ended, Mia's gaze met Jake's. There was a quiet understanding between them, but it was tinged with a new concern. "Jake," Mia started, her voice gentle but firm. "We've been down this road before. You promised me you were going to make a change. And I get it, your work is important, but I can't be a part of this if it's just going to keep happening. I'm not asking you to quit your job. I just need you to stick to the promises you made. Jake took a deep breath, feeling a familiar tension in his chest. This was the moment of truth. He had fought hard for this relationship, and now, it was at a crossroads. He could continue down the path of always saying yes to work, pushing Mia aside once again, or he could finally put his foot down and show her that she truly mattered more than anything else. I know, Mia, Jake said quietly, his voice thick with regret. I can't keep doing this to you. I can't keep sacrificing us for something that doesn't matter in the long run. I've learned that lesson the hard way. Mia looked at him, her eyes soft but filled with uncertainty. Then what are you going to do about it, Jake? Because words don't mean much anymore. You've said you'll change before, and I need to see it this time. I need to know you're really all in. Jake stood up, walking over to his desk where the phone and laptop sat. His fingers hovered over the keys, and for a moment, he felt the full weight of his decision. This wasn't just a business opportunity, it was a test of his commitment to Mia and their future together. I'm going to email Carlos, Jake said, his voice resolute. I'm going to tell him that I'm not taking the project. I've spent enough time choosing work over you. It ends now. Mia stood up, walking over to him, her face serious but proud. Jake. I'm sorry, Mia, Jake interrupted. I don't want to keep hurting you. I've learned that no job, no success, is worth sacrificing what I have with you. I choose you. Mia felt a wave of emotion wash over her as she watched him sit down at the desk, typing the email to his boss. She knew this was a huge decision for him, one that could have long-lasting consequences at work, but she also knew that Jake was finally understanding what it meant to prioritize what mattered most. Jake hit send on the email and turned to Mia, his expression filled with relief. He was standing on the edge of something new, something that was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. I just hope I'm not making a huge mistake, Jake murmured. You're not, Mia replied softly. You're making the right choice. You're choosing us. That's all that matters. The next morning, Jake felt the weight of his decision settle in. His phone buzzed with messages from his team and his boss, Carlos. The emails and texts poured in, asking if he had seen the proposal and reminding him of the urgency of the project. But Jake had made his decision, and he wasn't going to back down. He called Carlos to explain his decision. Carlos, I need to be honest with you. I've decided not to take the project. I've realized that my personal life is more important right now. I need to focus on my relationship with Mia. I hope you understand. Carlos was silent for a moment, and Jake braced himself for the backlash. I understand, Jake, Carlos finally said, his voice uncharacteristically calm. But I have to tell you, this could affect your standing in the company. You've worked hard to get to this point, and turning down something this big will be noticed. Jake nodded, feeling the gravity of the situation. I get it. I'm prepared for the consequences. But I've made my choice. Mia and I are moving forward together. Mia, who had been sitting in the living room, overheard the conversation. She couldn't help but smile, a tear slipping down her cheek as she heard Jake's conviction. She knew how much this meant to him. The sacrifices he had made to put their relationship first were not easy, but they were necessary. When Jake hung up the phone and turned around, Mia was there, waiting. Without a word, she walked over to him, wrapping her arms around him tightly. You did the right thing, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Jake hugged her back, feeling the weight of everything lift off his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. He had chosen love over ambition, and that was a choice he would never regret. The decision Jake had made to prioritize his relationship with Mia wasn't an easy one. It was a choice that would alter the trajectory of his career and his personal life. As the days passed, he could feel the consequences of that decision. His colleagues were confused, and his boss, Carlos, wasn't pleased. But Jake also felt a deep sense of relief. For the first time in months, he wasn't torn between his work and Mia. He had chosen love, and that choice had given him peace. It wasn't all smooth sailing, though. There were moments when doubt crept in. Jake's phone would ring with an important client, or his inbox would flood with messages about deadlines he could no longer meet. Each time, he had to resist the temptation to dive back into the familiar world of late nights and endless emails. But with Mia by his side, he found the strength to stay grounded. They spent their days building the kind of life they both wanted, one filled with meaning, connection, and real presence. They traveled to nearby cities for weekend getaways, cooked dinner together, and even began discussing plans for the future. The more they talked about what they wanted together, the clearer their path became. Mia, too, was learning to trust Jake again. She saw the effort he was putting into their relationship, how he was choosing to be present, not just physically, but emotionally. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension, but Mia had learned to let go of the past and embrace what was in front of her. She could feel Jake's sincerity, and it reassured her that they were moving in the right direction. A few months later, Jake and Mia sat together on the balcony of their apartment, the city lights twinkling below them. It had become one of their favorite places to unwind, just the two of them, away from the noise of the world. "Can you believe how far we've come?" Mia said softly, leaning her head on Jake's shoulder. Jake smiled, his arm wrapped around her. "It hasn't been easy, but I'm so glad we've made it here. I don't think I could have asked for a better partner. You've taught me so much about what it really means to love and be loved." Mia looked up at him, her eyes filled with affection. "You've taught me, too. I used to think that love was all about big gestures and grand moments. But now, I know it's the little things. The everyday decisions to choose each other. The quiet moments of trust." Jake's heart swelled with gratitude. He had come to understand what Mia meant. It wasn't about the grand things, the business deals or the success that he had once chased so desperately. It was about the quiet commitment to be there, day in and day out, to choose each other when things got tough and when they were easy. It was about being present, truly present. "I'm excited for the future," Jake said, his voice filled with conviction. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. No more work distractions. No more excuses. Just us." Mia smiled, her heart full. "I'm ready for that," she said, resting her hand on his chest. "We've built something solid, Jake. And I know we can keep building." As the weeks turned into months, Jake and Mia continued to grow stronger as a couple. Jake's decision to step back from the high-pressure demands of his career allowed him to rediscover the joy of spending time with Mia, but it also gave him a deeper understanding of himself. He realized that his identity wasn't tied to his job or his success. He was someone who valued connection, love, and the small, everyday moments that made life meaningful. Mia, too, found a renewed sense of self. She had always been independent, but now she saw the beauty in building a life with Jake, a life that wasn't perfect, but one that was real and full of promise. They talked about marriage, about family, and about dreams for the future. It wasn't always easy, and there were moments when they disagreed, but they knew that their relationship was worth fighting for. They had learned the hard way that true love wasn't about perfection, it was about working through the imperfections together. One evening, as they walked through the park near their apartment, Jake stopped and turned to Mia, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Mia," he said, his voice steady. "I've been thinking. I want us to take the next step. I want to marry you." Mia's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she was speechless, overcome with emotion. She had always known how much Jake loved her, but hearing him say those words out loud made her realize just how far they had come. The man standing in front of her wasn't the same man who had struggled to find balance. This was the man who had chosen her, over and over again, and who had grown with her. "Yes," Mia whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Yes, I'll marry you." Jake pulled her into his arms, holding her close as they both laughed, the sound echoing through the park. It was a moment of pure happiness, a moment they would cherish forever. In the months that followed, Jake and Mia began planning their wedding. They kept it simple, just close friends and family, a celebration of their love and the journey they had been on together. It was a day filled with laughter, tears, and memories that would last a lifetime. When Mia finally appeared at the end of the aisle, her smile radiant, Jake's heart skipped a beat. In that moment, everything else faded away. The stress, the doubt, the pressure of the world, it all melted into nothing as he looked at the woman he loved. Mia reached him, her hand in his, and they exchanged vows, promising to stand by each other's side for better or for worse. As they sealed their vows with a kiss, the crowd erupted into applause, but all Jake could hear was the steady beating of his own heart. He had found his home, his person, and his future. Jake and Mia's story didn't end with their wedding day. It was just the beginning of the rest of their lives together. They faced new challenges, of course. Jake's career continued to evolve, and Mia had her own dreams and ambitions. But no matter what came their way, they knew they had each other. They had learned that love wasn't about avoiding challenges, it was about facing them together, with trust, communication, and commitment. Years later, as they sat together on their balcony, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, Jake turned to Mia, his heart full of gratitude. "I never thought I'd end up here," he said softly. "But I'm so glad I did." Mia smiled, her hand resting on his. "Me too, Jake. Me too." And as they sat there, side by side, they knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, always choosing each other, always building their love, one day at a time. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?